Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
Today we're going to talk about changes in the social agenda. Among those things, abortion, the morality of it, as well as the economics. And we're going to talk about balanced budgets. Why is it that if the Indiana legislature can balance the state budget, the U.S. Congress cannot or will not balance the federal budget? Panelists for today's Public Affairs Roundtable include Mike Seaborg from Economics, who will be discussing David Stockman's legacy and balanced budgets, both state and national. George Pilcher from History, who will talk about the social agenda of conservatives. And John Rouse from Political Science, who will be commenting on Hoosier views on abortion. George Pilcher, is there a conservative agenda, and if there is, what is it?
Well, I think there is a conservative agenda. It's not a Republican agenda, it's not an administration agenda. But I think the conservative agenda focuses principally upon school prayer and abortion. I think perhaps it focuses more on school prayer than it does on abortion. I think that they understand, the conservatives understand, that they can achieve their objectives, perhaps, in terms of silent prayer, more easily than they can achieve their objectives on abortion. But I think that we have to recognize, and perhaps many of the conservatives recognize, that this is not an administrative agenda. It's a distraction to the administrative agenda. The administrative agenda, I think, is the budget, is the federal deficit. And I believe the administration plays a bit to the conservative agenda in order to keep the folks back home happy.
Well, that's what I was going to say. You say it's not the administration agenda, but it sure sounds a lot like Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign.
I think presidential campaigns and political agenda are different things. Ronald Reagan is president now. He was running for president then.
And he has accomplished what in these areas? Very little.
I think he has accomplished very little in those areas, but I think that those became part of his presidential campaign in order to get elected. I don't think that they reflected his deeply committed personal views about the most important things that needed to be done in the country, and I think those are economic things.
George, President Reagan has come under quite a bit of criticism lately in regard to his foreign policy, in that he talks awfully tough and then acts in a conciliatory way after the tough talk. Is the same pattern discernible with regard to the social issues as well?
I think that's right. I think that, again, the president says things for public consumption and does things for the good of the United States. Those things may be somewhat different. And I think that's illustrated in his pronouncements on social issues, his pronouncements on certain aspects of foreign policy especially.
George, I think the thing that we are interested in here, of course, are the perspectives of these issues that you speak of, school prayer, abortion, busing, for example. Are these issues very important to citizens who live here in the Hoosier State?
I think they are important to people who live in the Hoosier State, but I think that perhaps they are not the most important things. I think that we are in a time when bread and butter issues are the issues that concern the American people. And I think that people in Indiana are not significantly different, if you will, from all the rest of the people in the United States. I think that, in a sense, we have, for one reason or another, kind of set social issues aside, put them into kind of a second-level category, if you will. If advances can be made on a conservative social agenda, well, that's all right, but that's not the most important thing we're after.
Are there going to be changes in this agenda, or are these busing, school prayer merely going to be, I guess, vehicles to help the religious right raise money on television? I mean, is there a conclusion to any of these issues?
Well, I think potentially there is a conclusion. We might say that a successful constitutional amendment authorizing prayer in schools in one form or another would be a conclusion to the issue, insofar as these things are ever concluded. I think a successful constitutional amendment directed to the abortion issue in one way or another would at least put an end to the issue for a long time, in the sense that prohibition put an end to an issue for a long time. It would not put an end to abortions, but it might put an end to the political issue.
Make the issue red. John Rouse, along those lines, abortion has been a very emotional, very hot topic, presidential campaign in and out of politics. Is there a conclusion to that kind of issue, or is it with us forever?
Yeah, I think it's with us until the technology changes. In a sense, it's with us now because of the technology. I think it's a very difficult issue, as you say, and with abortion, basically people take abortion out of context. And what I'm saying is that today we have what I call the throwaway society. In other words, I have an 81 Citation, for example. The last car I had was a 69 Chevrolet. That 69 Chevrolet was a lot stronger, a lot more durable than this 81 Citation appears to be. You go into a fast food restaurant, you throw your plastic away and so forth. You talk about the throwaway society in terms of violence, guns, for example. Thousands of Americans are killed every day on the streets, and we accept it. Also in terms of drunk drivers, we allow drunk drivers to murder people on the streets. So what I think is not being, or what is not occurring, is that we do not take the issue of abortion in context of these other things. So basically, in terms of the politics of all this, I think indeed that the Reagan administration is playing politics, and when it comes to the politicians, and also people, they have certain attitudes about abortion, but their behavior is completely different.
You're saying the Reagan administration is using this issue as a political issue with no real intent to try to resolve the...
No, I think that the Reagan administration is responding politically. But the most important priorities are economic issues, political issues, and then lastly, social issues. Now, I would also say in a way that abortion really can be an economic issue. And you say, for example, if a young woman who's 16 years of age gets pregnant and she's not married, she lives in a working class family, her mother and father work, what is she going to do in terms of long-term prospects on raising that child and maintaining her own living? If you take another illustration of a Catholic family, 4 children, both parents work, the wife gets pregnant for the 5th time, and what happens? She comes close to a nervous breakdown. This is a very serious economic issue. So I think we have to look at the issue in context in order to try to understand it better.
John, I've got a couple of comments, and I might take sort of an opposing view on that. There are economic consequences to having children, or unwanted children, if you like, or unplanned children. On the other hand, there are economic consequences of making abortion too much of a fact in our society. It's clear that even if abortions were not legal, that they would continue to be done in an illegal way, but there probably wouldn't be nearly as many. And
I think you're right in a sense, Mike, and I will never try to defend something that cannot be defended. But my point is, in terms of education on this issue, the number of abortions has decreased by 30% in Indiana since 1980. Overall, in terms of the number of abortions, they increased across the country between 1973 and 1980. In 81 and 82, they stabilized. And you have to ask, why did this happen? Are people, is sexual behavior among young people changing? I doubt it. But I would say that they are learning about the consequences of this. So I would never want to be in the position of trying to defend something that cannot be defended. The issue of abortion is a very serious moral issue.
I would agree with that, John, but the number of abortions have stabilized at in my view, an unacceptably high level. If we're looking at the economics of it, we're looking at a population that simply is not growing anymore in a natural way. We're looking at a population distribution that is going to be skewed towards retirees by the year 2020. And by encouraging abortions, I'm not sure that we're aiding the economy whatsoever.
I think it's very important for us to recognize the facts, and we will disagree in terms of what can be done about it. It's a very serious concern. Now I think it's a good sign to recognize that here in Indiana, that the number of abortions, for example, in 1980 was 19,000, over 19,000. In 83, the last time we have figures for, it was just under 14,000. So the issue is, it seems to me, in terms of education on this particular concern.
Do you think President Reagan's statements and anti-abortion statements have helped in this regard?
I do not believe that President Reagan does much to educate on the complexity of the total issue. As I said, my thrust today is that that the issue of abortion is not taken in context of other attitudes in society. If you call abortion murder, well, you can also call drunk drivers murderers, and certainly those folks who pull out a pistol and kill people at random on the streets.
Well, John, I'd argue there's one very important difference between a drunk driver who killed somebody and an abortion, and that mainly is in the area of intent. Clearly, a mother who chooses an abortion for whatever reason has made a conscious decision to do that. Usually, when a drunk driver runs over somebody, although he may have been in error when he drank and then drove, certainly did not intend to go out and kill somebody. So I think that's a very important difference.
I'm saying it's in context with other kinds of things that are accepted in society.
And of course, Micah, you define intent as the natural consequences of your voluntary act. You can reasonably assume that if you drink and you drive, that you might have an accident and kill someone. And legally, is that not intent?
You probably increase the probability that you will do that when you drink and you drive. It's quite possible, though, as a sober driver, you may also do that.
Well, the drunk driving thing, there's an increased awareness in that area. There's an increased awareness in the abortion issue, and these things seem to have come up since the Reagan administration, since the Reagan years. Has he had an influence on changing some attitudes of the American society, on morality in that sense?
Well, I think that Falwell and Reagan have an influence in terms of anytime anyone raises the issue, that has an influence. You don't know how the final impact is.
I think the abortion issue really came to a head long before, at least somewhat before Reagan became president. I lived in another state a decade ago, if you will, before he became president, and I remember the abortion issue being fought out there on a statewide basis. It was certainly a very emotional and a very heated issue, and I think it's a product of what we might call the women's movement or the feminist movement in the United States, which has primarily escalated this. I really don't think that Reagan. I think really Reagan has talked about it very little when you stop and think about all of the things that the president has said. It's almost as though when he talks about it, it's a ritualistic kind of thing. He's expected to say something, so he says something, sort of, oh, by the way.
But hasn't his political campaigns and perhaps the people he puts around him in the White House raise the awareness of that issue? He's elevated it to a national debate, more so than just a state debate. In the same way, Nancy Reagan's involvement in anti-drug, the drunk driving thing, hasn't the Reagan administration increased the awareness of some of these issues?
Well, I think that we might argue that that's equally, if not more so, a product of the people in Congress. Prominent senators, especially Republican senators, now in the majority of the Senate, people who are in positions of public power, public visibility, the Orrin Hatches of the world, if you will, forcing this issue. They're the people, I think, who gain the media attention, not the people that Reagan puts in around him in the administration.
I'd argue Reagan has created an atmosphere that allows that, whereas other presidents have not. In fact, he actually encourages that kind of debate among his own people, that kind of discussion.
Well, I think that's probably true, but again, I think that, again, we're back to perhaps a matter of where this fits on the president's agenda.
Larry, I think we're also in what I would call the high technology, fast lane living society. And as technology changed in the 1960s as far as birth control was concerned, you also had a corresponding change in the behavior of individuals regarding sex. And perhaps the only way out of this dilemma is with new kinds of technology that will not have abortion as a final solution to the issue.
Well, we have that technology, John. Isn't it interesting to you that the people who are violently opposed to legalized abortion are also opposed to sex education, are opposed to the distribution of birth control advice and devices? It intrigues me that in those nations with extremely low abortion rates, we have very well-developed public sex education programs and the availability, virtually free, of birth control devices.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think one of the problems with the Christian right is that they hammer on the symptoms and not on the causes. And the causes are much deeper, even though the woman who has the abortion may be accused of murder. You have to understand some of the economic perspectives behind it and some of those dynamics. You may not agree with them, Mike, but I'm afraid that the Christian right doesn't get underneath some of those dynamics.
I just don't understand the economic dynamics that you're talking about. If you're talking about a market for children, for instance, I think there definitely is one. My wife and I have been, for a number of years, trying to adopt a child, for instance. Very difficult to find a child to adopt.
Well, that's
so
the
our
part
family would have been deeply blessed, for instance. Now I'm talking on moral grounds,
Sure.
but also economic grounds. Would have been deeply blessed if, some women had decided not to abort a child and to give it up for adoption, for instance.
Well, I
that
think,
child then would find a family.
yeah, I think that kind of information has to get out so there can be other kinds of alternatives.
Okay, but in that regard, don't you think this public discussion is useful in the question that the Reagan administration has raised?
It's always useful in terms of the political aspect of raising the issue because you have more discussion, and in some kind of way, discussions like this can help us all understand the dynamics of why people do the things they do.
Well, we've agreed earlier that, in fact, abortion, the social agenda here is really not the Reagan priority. In fact, we're talking about economic terms. So let's turn to something in which nothing else as well is being accomplished, balancing a budget. Jimmy Carter talked about it, Ronald Reagan promised it faithfully, and here we are, David Stockman, finally, the budget director, finally leaving the administration, and we're still talking in terms of hundreds of billions of dollars of deficits each year. If that's a priority, why isn't something being done in that area?
Well, that's right, Larry. David Stockman did leave, and I think he left basically out of frustration. When he became budget director 5 years ago, he was very ambitious. He had set as a personal goal and as an administration goal to cut the size of government as a percentage of the economy, and he'd also set as a goal to decrease the size of the deficit, and this was advertised and broadcast in a great deal. And over time, of course, he has failed in both of those regards. And I think if you look at the tenure of David Stockman, although he's received a lot of accolades in the press and so on, you have to consider it basically as a failure when viewed in achieving those two major goals.
Is it David Stockman's failure, though?
No, you can't blame any individual for the failure of the budget process. But in looking at the record, what I'm saying, if you look, for instance, at the size of the federal government over time as a percentage of the total economy, you find that when David Stockman and the Reagan administration, when David Stockman assumed his position as director of OMB, the federal outlays were about 23% of the total gross national product. Today, as he leaves, we find that federal outlays are about 25% of the total gross national product. Indeed, over the Reagan administration and over the Stockman years, we have not cut down the scale of government as a percentage of our economy. In fact, it has grown, and it has grown significantly.
How do you account for that? What's happened? It seems to me that since Reagan has been president, the government has in fact been doing less and less, and that the services which government provides to citizens, to states, seem to have dwindled. Whether that's a good or bad thing is irrelevant. If that's the case, why have not budget outlays dwindled?
I think you're right, George, in your observation. But basically what has happened over the years is that David Stockman has lost out to the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger. And we found that over those same years that the defense budget has increased by some 88% and has become an increasingly large portion of federal outlays. At the same time, Stockman, I guess, has had some successes. But as you point out, the areas of his success have been in cutting certain domestic programs.
To say that Caspar Weinberger has won out over David Stockman is to suggest then that it's not a fact that Congress cannot balance the budget but will not. Is that what you're saying?
Well, we can't lay all the blame on Congress. The administration has campaigned aggressively, the President has campaigned aggressively for large increases in defense spending. And I think although David Stockman's own personal agenda was to decrease the budget and the scale of government, that played a distant maybe second or third in terms of Reagan's plan.
The political fallout then for Reagan then is that he would rather have a deficit budget to maintain whatever his priorities are in that area and just go ahead and take the flack from the public who says, you know, why isn't the budget balanced?
Reagan would like to cut the deficit. After all, over his administration, we've seen the deficit increase some threefold from the Carter years, from 1980 when Carter left office. Remember how we were complaining about the scale of the deficit then? It's threefold that much now, and it's projected to be $213 billion for fiscal '85. And Reagan would very much like to narrow that deficit, but not at the expense of defense spend, or not at the account of defense spending. And also, he's just recently made a concession that he wouldn't hold the lid on Social Security payments, and so Social Security will continue to increase as well. So that leaves very little area then when you carve out national defense, Social Security, payments on interest for the national debt, which they can't control. That leaves very little area to cut from. And David Stockman, in that little area that remains, those are the areas that really touch the lives of us all in cities and so on, as George pointed out. David Stockman, I guess, has had some success. He's cut, as the Office of Management, or the Congressional Budget Office estimates that he's cut through his proposals that were accepted by Congress. The current budget is $38 billion less than it otherwise would be, but that's almost all of those cuts are in social programs, particularly programs that were implemented during the liberal years, I guess, of the 60s and early 70s.
As was the case, or as is the case on the abortion issue, it seems that politicians have certain kinds of attitudes about budget cutting, but when it comes to the real, actual behavior, they don't do much about cutting the budget. And as a teacher of public administration, let me speak up for the two real heroes in the Reagan administration, and they are the non-elected bureaucrats. They were Stockman, who was willing to stand up to the colonels in the military about military spending, and Paul Volcker, who stands up against high interest rates. So it seems like the two people with any courage in politics are the folks that are not elected.
Balanced budget is a political issue. Is someone going to actually make that an issue in the '88 election? Is somebody going to stand up again and say, I'm going to balance the budget in 4 years? Anyone dare do that now?
Sure, the Democrats will campaign for a balanced budget in the next presidential election. You have my guarantee.
Well, I mean, this become a stock issue. Well, what are they going to say? We will cut it out of military? I mean, is that...
Sure, they'll take it out of military. 10 years ago, it used to be pointed out to us that military spending, having shrunk to a relatively small portion of the budget, the only place we could make cuts was in domestic entitlement programs. Probably the Democrats will come back and tell us that the swollen military budget now becomes a prime target for cutting.
Yeah, I would disagree, because I think what's going to happen is that the philosophical conservatives are going to have to accept that deficit, and they will tell us that really it doesn't matter.
But it does matter. The deficit matters a great deal, despite what you hear from the
psychological, or is it really
from
economic?
the perspective of economics or politics.
From the perspective of economics, it matters a great deal. I think most economists, with the exception of sort of a supply-side branch of the conservative wing, I suppose, of the profession, would argue that large deficits large deficits that are sustained over time during a period of recovery will put significant pressures on our economy. In particular, they'll drive up interest rates.
To get the politicians to quit talking and start acting on this issue?
Basically, I think there has to be some willingness on the part of the administration to push for either one of two things, or both. To push for cuts in defense spending, or to push for a tax increase.
David Stockman.
We've been talking about closing the budget by cutting spending. But the other alternative is to increase revenue.
David Stockman accused the generals in the Pentagon of being more concerned about their pensions than about the national defense. Is it proper to accuse the members of Congress about being more concerned about their next election than about the national interest?
That could be true. But again, when we're dealing with pork barrel projects that are important to congressmen in their own area, which they always defend, and which balloons the budget. Again, we're talking about that relatively small portion of the budget that isn't going to have much effect. The only way to have a great effect on the deficit itself is to cut defense, to put a cap on Social Security cost of living allowances, or thirdly, and I think it's going to come to this, and Walter Mondale must be grinning ear to ear, to increase taxes.
And I'll cut off right there. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. George Pilcher, Mike Seaborg, and John Rouse. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producer is Mike Seaborg. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.